myself right. Reach out and touch the sky. Boy, you with me, don't wait for nights. Going baptized, yes, spirit baptized. Going in and to help myself right. Reach out and touch the sky. Boy, you with me, don't wait for nights. Going baptized, yes, spirit baptized.
Hey, welcome back to I'm Going In. My name is Todd Blyleven, and I'm your host. And I've got an incredible guest today that was introduced to me. She's actually a neighbor down in a little bit further south of me in Texas. Her name is Tatiana Miller, and she is a psychologist, expert in clinical stress management, health consultant. She's defied odds of walking again after a paralyzing accident, which we're going to hear about later. That's really led her on a path of healing and redefining her own well-being, on top of her being a two-time author and founder of RX for Life, which provides a holistic approach to empowerment, wellness, and growth. She's a professor in college. She's a mom. We have something in common in the sports world, but Tatiana, thank you so much for coming on I'm Going In. I tell my guests what this show is all about is defining the moment when you decided at some point when you were knocked down in your life to stand back up and say, you know what, I'm going in. I'm going in for myself. I'm going in for others. It's sometimes that happens simultaneously. Sometimes we learn how to go in for others, and you're doing that now. So again, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I love that. You just defined resilience. That's literally the definition of resilience, right? The ability to bounce back in the face of adversity. And I love that. I love that about you. I love that you're having this podcast, because I think everybody in different points in our lives, we have choices to make, right? We're either going to let the circumstances take us into survival and define who we're going to be, or take us into thriving and redefine who we're going to be. And I think that that's like the story of life, right? There's a lot of different challenges that life is going to offer us, and it's really important to have these conversations and to let people know that they're not alone.
You couldn't have said it better. What I found after going through my more traumatic experience, we deal with trauma throughout our lives, right? It's not just that big moment, but I think it's little micro traumas and things and accidents that we go through that give us the coping skills to deal with that big moment when it happens. And when I went through mine, I became really vulnerable. I became very open. It knocked me on my tail. And when all of a sudden this 6'5" guy is standing there, and I'm talking about love and feelings and how special like things are outside and how I'm feeling, which I was raised to suppress my emotions. I was a professional athlete, raised by a professional athlete, which we're going to get into, just like you and your dad.
Suck it
Which is
up.
really cool.
Suck it up is what you do with professional athletes.
Right. Yeah. Suck it up, buttercup. Like, just, you pitch with broken bones, or you play, hurt and pain, but you never talk about your fear. You never talk about what's really bothering you on the inside. So I found it to be a sign of strength.
Oh, absolutely.
I realized that there's nothing I ever have to prove to anybody in my life except for me, and making sure that I'm internally happy. And I find peace in helping others stand back up and walk tall again for themselves. So I want to hear about you. We have this commonality with your dad being a former professional athlete and mine, which was really interesting. And we were talking prior to the recording, just about what people don't quite always understand and realize about what goes on in the house of a professional athlete. But really, one of the biggest life lessons that you learn in the resilience piece, and just learning how to stand back up, the constant grind, the constant repetitiveness that you have to be, the routine driven focus that you have to be in that limelight and really go out and perform every single day, regardless of how you're feeling or not. What was that like for you growing up in that house, and how did that provide kind of coping skills to deal with what you dealt with?
I think it's exactly what you've been sort of describing. As children, we don't really realize what we're learning, right? We're just kind of taking life in and making sense of it as we go. But in retrospection now, I realize that my father has been one of the biggest teachers in my life. And that is because professional athletes, well, I mean, all athletes, but more professional athletes, right? They have to keep themselves poised. It's part of the game, any game, basketball, baseball, soccer, it's part of the game, right? You have to have a poker face because when your opponent knows you're vulnerable, you're in trouble, right? They already won. They already scored on you if they know you're vulnerable. So you kind of learn to have a poker face.
Yeah.
And my dad very much did allow us to work through our emotions and be vulnerable, but his MO was always like cool, calm, collected. I never remember my father screaming at me or losing his patience. Still to this day, he's very composed. And that taught me something, right? It taught me that cool and composed is the way you deal with crisis. And fast forward now, thinking about, what did I grab onto? And I always tell clients or people that I'm working with, like we all have something that we have to go internally and grab onto to find our strength. And I think I went and grabbed onto, I watched, my father, especially when, and I don't know if you know about this or not, but I had a sister that died in a car accident. My
No.
first week of college. Yeah, she was
Wow.
um, my closest sibling. We had a really close relationship, and my first week of college, this is when phones were like, remember with the cord? There
Mhm.
were no, there were quite no, I mean, there were, I don't even remember if there were cell phones or not. No, yeah, there were cell phones, but we still used old school phones in the dorm. And I came to the US for college, and my first week in college, the dorm phone in our little shared space that we had 4 rooms and a middle space we shared, went off. It was like 5 a.m. and I knew that phone call was for me. I just instinctively knew it, and I knew that it was bad. And I thought it was my grandparents that had passed. Never expected. And I remember my dad's voice. I remember that I could hear his pain, but it was still very collected. And he was like, there was an accident and your sister passed away. You need to come home. And it gives me chills and it fills me with
Wow.
emotion. But the way that my father guided me and my brother through it, um, was with poise and with grace and with love. And the hard part of that was that my stepmother was an alcoholic and she was driving and had killed my sister.
Oh,
So there were a lot of elements to that, but even through that, I what it was modeled for me, right? How to hold yourself together. And that is what I think I had to keep going back to when I realized that I couldn't feel my legs. I realized that I had to make choices in my life. I had doctors telling me that I was never going to walk again, that I just needed to get a ramp, and me and my husband needed to just like accept this. And at that point, I had 2 young kids. I had 2 young boys. I was a young mom. And I remember feeling like really like I didn't want to live. And I don't know if you went through this, but you kind of just feel like, how am I going to do this? Like, how am I going to not be who I know myself to be? But I remember watching my dad and talking with him through my sister's death. It was very public. There were reporters all over the place. I remember getting to the funeral home and, you know, there's paparazzi everywhere. My stepmother had ran into a federal light post. So like police,
wow.
it was a big to do. And I remember my dad and I had these long, long conversations, very vulnerable conversations. And that's, I think, one of the first times when I watched him just fall apart, just allow himself to fall apart. And he told me, he said, you know, I'm never going to be the same person that I used to be. And I know that, and I have to accept it. And that's just how it is. Right. And I think, that like with trauma,
Wow.
with deep trauma, you're never the same person.
No.
It's like you're not only grieving a loss, right? As I'm sure you grieved your loss and the loss of many lives in your experience, but you not only grieve your loss. You grieve the person who you were.
Right.
And it was very similar in my experience, right? I had to grieve who I knew myself to be and who I had to become to make it through, right? So I fell down like you described, and then the person that got up was not old Tatiana. It was a new Tatiana. And I find myself using that experience and what I watched from my dad, and then translating that into what I try to invoke in people now, and what I try to motivate people to do is to say, like, we all have to revamp, we all have to adapt, we all have to move forward with our pain, because that's life. And sometimes it's harder and uglier and messier than other times, and sometimes it's just, I'm moving to a new house, right? Pretty simple. Yet still on the change scale, very stressful for people, because change is hard for all of us. But I think my experience of having a professional athlete in my life really allowed me to see that for you guys, it's an everyday thing. Like every time an athlete steps on the pitch or the court or the field, it's an adaptation, and it's a having to be very present. And I think that's the other thing that I realized years later, because my dad was very like serious, but he would always hand me books like a meditation book or a Carte Toll book. And I realize now that athletes meditate every time they're doing their sport. They don't realize it, right? Like I've had conversations with my son, who's now a professional athlete too, and he's like, Mom, you taught me to meditate. And I'm like, I did? And he's like, yeah, you totally did. And I use it now. And that's, my secret sauce. And I realize that you guys are in your own place, in your own zone. And that's so cool. And that's what I had to learn to do too. And I realized that that's where my dancing that I love to do, it takes me. And all of us, I hope, can find that, whatever it might be. For some people, it's, playing chess. For some people, it's riding their bicycle. For some people, it's hiking. But my hope for every person is that they find that, because that's how we kind of reconnect with ourselves. And I watched my dad do that my whole life. And now I realize that it was his practice of being an athlete that taught me to be my own kind of athlete.
Yeah. The survivor symbol means so much to me as a mass shooting survivor. I wear my survivor phoenix with pride, representing strength and resilience. It reminds us that even when we feel knocked down, we're not alone. Together, we can rise stronger. A portion of the profits will support other survivors needing help. Get yours today at toddblyleven.com. You're so right on. There's, I think when you look at a professional athlete, you think that person has it together, 1% of mankind that can go out and perform that particular task, whatever sport you're watching, amazement, right? But you hit it right on the head when you started talking about like that pillar of strength and that calmness that you learn as an athlete, where you're constantly dealing with failure, right? As an athlete, you're constantly
more than winning, by the way. I said that this morning.
Totally.
I'm like, athletes fail, they have to, more than they win, right? They make the goal, the home run, whatever, less times than they ever do anything else, right? That's the rare moment.
Yeah. And so with that adaptation, like every moment, every pitch, every new play, every time that ball is dropped on the soccer field, whatever that is, it's a new opportunity to go and advance, right? To move forward, to try to succeed. And you're constantly strategizing. Golf. I love watching golf because it's one hit at a time, or pitching, baseball, it's one play at a time. Football, when people put their mouth guards in and they lock into that moment, that zone that they get into, and then it's this burst of energy for 3 or 4 seconds, and then it's rinse and repeat, right? And that's what you grew up around.
Yeah.
Learning.
Yeah, but I didn't realize that most people don't grow up watching that work ethic of your physical. They might grow up watching their dad be a hard worker in whatever industry they're in. But I think specifically for me, it took me, going to grad school and realizing, oh my goodness, like all of these things that we tried to teach people on emotional intelligence, on, how to perform better, how to be more productive, all of these things that we're all trying to learn. Athletes have to have it or they don't succeed. You
Right.
talk about like that 1%. So I'm going to teach, I know this is so funny, it even makes me giggle, a statistics course.
Mhm.
And I laugh because math was the only subject I thought to myself, am I stupid? Like, how am I ever going to pass this class? Right? Like, this is hard. My brain doesn't work that way. And then here I am years later, I'm going to teach this course, right? But, and I say that because when my son became a pro, I wanted to do a celebration for him. So I looked up what's the world population? There's like 8 billion people in the world, right? And then I looked up when he got his FIFA card, which, it's a big deal to get your card.
Wow.
And so then I looked up how many professional soccer players are there in the world, right? There's 123,000. So 123,000 out of 8 billion, that's 0.00000. So in his card, I wrote, you're in the 0% club. And he goes, Mom, what does this mean? And why does it matter if I'm in the 0%? And I'm like, because you're one of 8 billion people that accomplished this. And his answer to me was, well, you know what my grandfather told me? And I said, what? That's my dad. I said, what did he say? And he said, that doesn't matter. This is just the beginning. What are you going to do now? Right? Like,
Yeah.
not a win. That's not a win. That's just a stepping stone. And I'm going, but you're 0%. Like, how is
Yeah.
this not the best ever? And for them, it's like, what are you talking about? This is just the beginning, right? This thinking of greatness and of achieving their best potential. I think now is something that I try to translate into my work and my life is like, when you think big, that's small, right? Not a big deal to get my FIFA card. That's just the beginning. So when we have goals for ourselves, like my goal was, well, I want to be able to walk. And so now my goal is, well, now I can walk. So now I do these long, hard hikes, and so now I'm like, okay, now I can walk and do hard hikes. Well, now I want to cross mountains, and so it's like motivated me to push myself to try to be my best. And I'd never done that before.
When you I want to back up a second. I want to touch on something that I thought was really interesting when you talked about your dad. First of all, I'm really sorry that you lost your sister at such a young age. Um, but when your dad, made that phone call to you and it was that stone, that strength, obviously that you're used to hearing, but in a different way.
Totally different.
The grace and the love that lifted you, probably it kept you on your feet to get to that moment where you could see him and embrace him. Um, what happened with you? I mean, you mentioned like your legs but what happened? What caused you to become paralyzed
Oh,
with
sure.
your
So,
legs?
yeah.
And then talk about how that is relevant in that grace in that moment and how you were raised and the movement piece that you were talking about earlier on how that defined the moment when you said, I'm going in, I'm tired of this. Were you knocked down? Like, obviously you're paralyzed, but tell us about what happened and then how you were able to lift yourself back up.
Sure. I love that question. So I think I went in too much, too hard, and ignored my symptoms, right? That's what led me to like lose my reflexes. And so I'll backtrack.
Yeah.
So when I was a teenager, I started having some symptoms. I got told a ton of different things. They told me that I had cancer. They told me they weren't sure. They told me I had this, I had that. So for many years, since I was about 15, I started to have different symptoms. What now we know is an autoimmune disorder that attacks my bones. But for, oh my gosh, 15 years, which is pretty much the story of autoimmune, that people aren't sure. It's kind of a new diagnosis. Doctors will bounce you around from one specialist to the other because nobody wants to tackle it. Nobody's sure of it. So for years I got bounced around. Nobody knew what was going on. I had a bag this big of like all the pills you can imagine of them trying to treat this. Nobody quite figured it out. So I started having some pretty severe back pain when I was, oh, I guess 20. And I attribute it back to like being used to moving to like, oh, I worked out really hard. You know, when
Yeah.
you work out a lot and often, you kind of just get used to being sore and pain, and I dismissed it. That's why I say I went in too hard for too long, which a lot of athletes do, right? They ignore
Yep.
it 'cause they're used to it. And ultimately, people that are really fit or athletes, like we have a high pain threshold. So we're used to ignoring the signals our body is giving us, right?
Yep.
Because we're taught to push. So that's another thing to keep in mind, right? There has to be a harmony between pushing yourself and resilience and caring for yourself and listening to your body and your emotions.
That's huge.
So I, went on about my life, had a baby, continued to push myself. Um, After I had my first son, I had a horse and I was riding my horse, and I decided that it would be a great idea, even though I did English riding, which is a one form. It's like mountain biking versus, road biking, right? So like I did English writing and I decided it would be a great idea to take my horse and try to do barrel racing. And so,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
not a good idea. Not a good
Yeah.
idea at all. But I went to like try to go around the barrel, and my horse, of course, didn't know what it was doing and lost its footing. And the horse fell on me. So I rolled around the barrel, and my foot stayed stuck in the stirrup, and the horse fell on me. My grandmother,
Wow.
another very important, actually, she was my great grandmother, very important figure in my life, started the first racetrack in Mexico City with my great grandfather. And so
Wow.
I grew up listening to her, who was one of the first women horse trainers in the world. One of the
Wow.
first women, to be like, I'm going to wear jeans and high heels and train these horses. And so she had a really strong Irish personality. And she always taught me that when you fall off that horse, you get back on that horse because you're the boss. So I got
Mm.
up in a lot of pain, and I was like, oh my gosh, got to get back on that horse. But I forgot to tell you something too that is a huge part of me, which is like faith. And I believe that, God has a plan for all of us, and we have to trust our instinct and those little signs that God sends us. So that day when I went to ride, I had left my helmet in the car. And like many people do for many different reasons, we're lazy and we don't want to wear our helmets. But something inside of me kept saying, just go get your helmet. Just walk back to your car and get your helmet. If I
Wow.
hadn't had my helmet, I probably wouldn't be able to have this interview.
Yeah.
But something told me to go get my helmet, and I did. So thank goodness I was wearing my helmet. So I got back
Amen to
up.
that. Wow.
I got back up, got on the horse, and started having horrendous back pain after that. I already had back pain before that, but that really like just accelerated my back pain. So I went to see a doctor after that accident, an orthopedic surgeon, and they were like, you really need back surgery. Like your back is so, at that point they were like, your autoimmune is really um what's it called, when your bones start to get thin, um like eating up my bones, basically. My bones
Yeah.
were, or like osteopenia, which is when your
Oh,
bones start
wow.
to thin. So you're growing these like tentacles out of your low back that are starting to press on your nerves. And that's why you have so much pain. And when you fell off the horse, it pushed all of your discs out. So I had
So your
this,
bones were like really brittle, or
yes,
they were
yes,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
They weren't deteriorating. They were just very brittle.
They were deteriorating. Yeah,
Oh,
they were
wow.
they were
Okay.
thinning out, and they
Wow.
had started to grow like these branches out from the
Wow.
middle of the back. But
Yeah.
the horse accident, pushed out my discs from L4 down.
Oh, wow.
And so my pain started to get increasingly worse.
Yeah.
However, I was a young mom, and I had just started going back to grad school studying holistic medicine. And I was working in a hospital doing employee health, and I really loved my life, and I didn't want to stop my life to take care of myself, right?
Yeah.
This is the story of a lot of adults and how their diseases or their ailments progress, right? So I
Yeah.
didn't want to stop, and I thought I'll just deal with the pain. And my husband at night, my pain was so bad. He would take these huge, the round weight plates that are, you put on barbells. He would
Yeah.
take 45-pound weight plates and set them on my back because the pressure eased my pain. And
Because it would
my,
straighten it out a little bit.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And my
Wow.
pain got progressively worse and unmanageable. I started to have I couldn't hold stuff. My hand would start to shake. My legs would shake.
Wow.
Uh, I was like cutting something one day and I lost my grip and it like cut my other hand.
How long did this go on?
So it went on for about a year after
Oh,
that.
wow.
And then I teach yoga and I love to teach yoga. And so I was teaching a yoga class and I was demoing a twist. I was like twisting my body and my legs came out from under me. And before I hit the floor, I knew I was like, I can't feel my legs. I just knew it. Like I knew it. 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 So they came to try and like roll me over and I was like, I can't move. You guys got to call the ambulance. I can't move. I know exactly what's going on. L4, L5. They're like, yeah, 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 whatever. And I'm like, no, I know. I know. And so that
Wow.
like forced me into having to take action. But I had waited so long and, like many people ignored symptoms and thought, oh, I'll deal with it. However, we justify and rationalize, which we all do with different things in our life, right? Everybody
Yeah.
has something in their life that's really there, and we're like, oh, I'll deal with it later. I'll deal with it later, whether it be a
Yeah.
relationship or a job or an emotion or a decision, we all do it.
Yeah.
And so I did that. And by then it was really progressed. My insurance refused to pay for my back surgery. At that point, they told me I'd lost all my reflexes on the left side of my body. All four orthopedic surgeons that I went to see here in the US were like, you just have to get used to it. You're not going to gain your reflexes back. We can try 2 or 3 surgeries. You can get, metal, you can get pig parts. And I was like, no, no, I don't
Wow.
accept that. Not having it. Don't want to do that.
Mm.
Um, and so thankfully, my dad and my grandfather had a friend that was an orthopedic surgeon in Mexico City, which is where I'm from. So I flew down there and I went to see him, and he said, I think I can help you. I think I can give you some hope, but you have to come and stay in Mexico City. And that was really hard for me because I'd always been a very involved mom. I didn't want to leave my kids. And I was scared.
Yeah.
I was scared because, like I said, when you fall down, right, and then you get up, you're a different person. And I had to come to terms with the fact that my life as I knew it was no longer going to be that. My body as I knew it could no longer function. Um, and that I had to do this. But I think for me, the hardest part, besides just like accepting it and making decisions and taking the steps that I needed to move forward, was realizing that I had to do this alone, that nobody could do it for me. And it was the
Wow.
first time in my life that as a human and as a woman, I realized that there's so many things we have to do on our own internally that nobody can do for us. And that if we just are brave enough and have that courage to do, and like you said, all of a sudden, here's this big guy talking about love. But you knew that when you were doing it, you're like, this feels right, right? But
Yeah.
only you could do it.
Yeah.
And for me, it was the same. I knew that I had to take this time to like do the work. And the work for me was accept that this was happening, accept that I had to be in another country away from my children and my husband to do this, accept that there was a big possibility that I wasn't going to walk and that I wasn't going to have what I perceive as a functional life. And at that point in my life, I
Yeah.
didn't, back to my dad and just
Mhm.
that poise and stuff. the doctors had a really long conversation with me, and they said, listen, there's a huge possibility this is such a big surgery. There's so many things wrong with you. At that point, they told me my back looked like the back of a 75-year-old woman, and I was 33 years old. And
Jeez.
so they said, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. This is a very sensitive part in the human body. And we need you to sign all these waivers and write a will. We need you to write a will. We need to have this conversation with your husband. You need to pick, a person to make medical decisions in case something goes wrong in the surgery. There's a possibility that we might hit nerves that will affect your functionality. And so I went to my husband and I was like, if this doesn't work, I don't want to live. And if this something goes wrong, I need you to let me die in this surgery. And he lost it, couldn't handle it. But it took me a lot of reflection, a lot of self-work to like make decisions for myself, of what was right for me.
Yeah.
And this is right, like a metaphor, a reflection of a lot of things in our lives that don't sit well with other people, but are right for us. And I prayed and meditated, and it felt right for me.
Yeah.
And nobody in my family could accept that. There was a huge tumultuous, you can imagine when tensions are high, except my dad.
You are touching on some too many times we make decisions based on others,
Mhm.
their interpretations of what we should be doing, or just the fact that we're afraid to come out and say we're going to do this, and that backlash that you get sometimes. So for you to stand up for yourself, and you went in, I mean, no pun intended for the podcast, but you went in for yourself in that given
Yeah,
moment because you knew that you had so much to give. I mean, and that must have been extremely difficult to go from the person that you were riding your horse, even though it was like English, and I don't know what you're thinking trying to barrel race at that moment, but you did, because that's probably like your daring personality, right? Push it to the edge, to the limit, because that's how you were raised. I mean, listen to the story about your grandma. That's incredible. Like, you painted the picture perfectly, like out of a John Wayne movie or something. And so cool. But
she
you
was
went
in
in.
movies, by the way. She was in movies. She was
Really?
in movies with like Tom Bullock and stuff. Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my gosh.
She was quite a character, very spicy lady. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But that's who you are. That's in your
right.
blood flow. But I
Yeah,
think the important part to this is that you did it for yourself, because in the end, you really need to be individually happy,
absolutely. And
right?
yeah, and I also think like I worked later on in life after I walked again and stuff. I worked as a part of a pain team in a hospital, and I was the
Wow.
holistic therapy for the hospital. I created a whole program for them. And I remember watching families making medical decisions, and patients a lot of times get completely left out of decisions that affect their life and the quality of their life.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
oftentimes we forget that it's not about what we want. It's about the patient. It's, and I think that was so helpful for me when I was on the pain team, is to be an advocate for the patient. And I still get referrals often from injuries or people that are having a hard time dealing with what's happening to their body, because it's affecting their life and functionality. And I think often with chronic illness and chronic pain and disabilities and paralysis, what people forget is that the person loses who they are. And that is something really hard to reconcile. And we can't just expect people to get over it or to move on. Like, it's a process, it's a grieving process, and it's also very personal.
Yeah.
I look at people that are paralyzed or have been paralyzed and do it with such grace and just like really have this resilience and bounce back into their life. And I always look at them and I always think, that is such amazing strength, because I don't think I could have had that. I really don't. Like, I still stand by my decision that I made that day. But I highly, highly respect people that would have chosen something else. Like, because it's so unique to who we are and what works for us.
Yeah.
Um and yeah, it was really difficult for me. But my dad was the only person in my family that was like, I'll be the next of kin. I will respect your wishes. And he did. A lot of things went wrong in that surgery. The hospital ran out of blood. I was bleeding out. They had to put an ad on TV to get people to come and donate blood. And there was a moment,
Wow.
there was a moment where my dad had to decide, do we keep going or do we stop? And he said, well, her wishes are to stop. And the doctor said, I can't do that. And so he kept going, and here I am, and it worked. But I
That's
think, yeah,
amazing.
right, like God had a plan. Like
Oh, God always has a plan.
he had a plan, and his
Yeah.
plan really was to say, you know what? Okay, all these things that sucked and were hard and brought you so much pain, you're now using that to help others. And
Yeah.
it is a driving force in my life to say, hey, hard things happen, but look at what we can do with that energy, right? And then translate it into something so powerful and so great. And I always tell people, like, these types of things are opportunities. The same, as would happen to you. It's a crushing thing. It's a devastating thing that we're seeing more and more of in the world, right? Violence and
Yeah.
and you never know where you're going to be and if you're going to be okay. But my hope for people is don't stop living. We
Mm.
can't let those things make us stop living. We can be careful. We can be more aware. I'm a big advocate to tell people, like, don't ignore your symptoms. We all know they're there and
Yeah.
we all
Yeah.
choose to ignore them, right? So we all have to advocate for safety, healthy communities. And that often doesn't happen.
You're so right. And, you touched on something earlier. Um, sometimes we deal with physical pain. We deal with physical ailments. Our bodies get altered in certain ways. We're in accidents. We have, whatever it may be, a broken bone or something. But the mental aspect coming out of that, I think, is the most challenging, right? I mean, you went through your physical therapy, you fought to stay alive.
I fought the doctors here when I told them you're wrong.
Right.
I was like, no, I don't accept that. There has to be another option. And this doctor in Mexico said, yeah, there's this surgery that I do that I think will help you. And it did, right? And I'm stronger than ever, and I'm more mobile than I ever was. And I have phantom pain because they cut off half my hip and used that to fuse my spine. So I have phantom pain in my hip where they cut my hip. But other than that, I'm in a great place. And after my surgery and I recovered, and I asked the doctor, like, why don't they do this in the US? Do you know what he said? He said it doesn't make money.
Oh, geez. Yeah. I mean, I've heard that before.
So that's a whole other conversation for,
Yeah.
for another topic. But if I hadn't been resilient and if I hadn't been searching for what was right for me,
Right.
I would most likely be paralyzed or probably, depressed, which of course I was for a while. I think all of us that experience a crisis of that magnitude go through stages of extreme grieving where we just feel so low, right? That it can be called depression.
100%. Yeah. No, when I got, I tell people this, after my 8 hours of going through what I went through in Las Vegas and seeing everything that I saw and physically exhausted, pain, I ripped my shoulder out from lifting bodies up and throwing them over my shoulder, like my hips, hernias, but the mental side of trying to figure out what the heck am I supposed to do now? And when you mentioned that about your dad and like, I'm never going to be the same, you're not. And the at the turning point, like I lost my innocence in that first shot of that gun. I lost the innocence of going into any place before and didn't really care about checking exit points. You're always conscious, but not to the level that I am now, where I live with my trauma out in front of me, right? And that's the whole part of, like, I think what I love about your story is you've been able to grab your experiences in life, the things that have knocked you down, and you keep them like way out in front of you, and you've learned through adaptation how to like navigate when things start to get a little bit challenging. And for me, like my spidey senses, I call it, when I go into a crowded place and I'm feeling a little uncomfortable, or I'm just nervous for whatever reason during the day, and I can hear my voice, I'm starting to stutter a little bit. That's my trauma starting to back up on me, because maybe I've added too much to myself. Maybe I have too many things on my plate. Maybe I'm in an environment I just shouldn't be in right now, or I'm uncomfortable. So how do you get that trauma out in front of you, or back out in front of you, to where you can breathe again? You can relax. You can keep moving, like you were talking about. You can't move. There's no movement if
No,
you
your
don't
nervous
take care of
system
this,
paralyzes
right?
you. Right.
Right?
Because I mean, we're designed, right? Your nervous system does three things. It paralyzes you, it makes you fight, or it makes you run.
There you go. Yeah.
And so we can't. I I actually have a beautiful young lady, and she, full permission to talk about her, by the way. She was attacked by a barracuda,
Oh my
and
gosh.
it bit her toes off. And the doctors couldn't figure out. A neurologist sent her to me and was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on. She keeps passing out. There's no evidence of seizures. Like, here you go. So
Yeah.
she comes to see me and we walk through, right? It's been a year and it's exactly what you said. And she keeps passing out. And my first question to her is, what is triggering you to pass out? Nobody, Todd, had asked her that question, right? That's that trauma right there,
There you
causing
go.
her nervous system to shut down. And her mom looked at me, she goes, nobody's asked us this in a whole year. And I'm like,
Wow.
trauma is so misunderstood. And
Yeah.
I promise you that I think that when you haven't experienced trauma, you cannot understand it. It is something that has to be experienced. We can read about it, we can hear about it, we can watch movies about it, but it's the same way why our armed forces are so misunderstood,
That's
because
right.
only they know their pain. Only they know what they've had to grasp inside themselves to do the things that they've had to do. And that's why our vets suffer so much, because
That's
they're
right.
not getting the help or the preparation beforehand that they need, or the crisis intervention during the things that they do that they need. And so I think that trauma is something that is so real and so rampant, but so untalked about, so misunderstood. And even the people around us that try to comfort us and support us and walk us through, I tell my clients all the time, I'm like, this is something that it's almost like, a group of us, right? Like when I haven't lived what you've lived, you haven't lived what I lived, but
Right.
you can almost go, yeah, I've felt that. I've been there. I've felt that like deep, heavy sadness of going, what the heck am I going to do with myself now? Like, or I'm so overwhelmed that I am going to pass out, which is
I
what's happening to my client.
That's a great point right there too. The relatability of trauma and what
Yeah.
it feels like. I had Bernie Meehan on. He was my first guest on the podcast, and he was at Sandy Hook. Unfortunately, he was one of the first brave first responders to go in that unfortunate situation. And he's been on over 400 critical incident calls in his career. He's seen a lot, and he recognizes when there's someone else that's talking to him that's experienced trauma, and he calls them, hey, we're trauma buddies now.
Yeah.
And he tries to make light of it, but the reality of it is, like, it's actually pretty sad that we've all had to go through this, but on the other side, we're strong, and we're learning more about ourselves than anybody else that
Absolutely.
has never gone through that, right?
Absolutely. I think,
Yeah.
I think, I think if you think about human beings, like from an anthropology perspective, historically, and athletes and everything, right? Like, we're designed to move through life and experience some sort of trauma. So man used to have to go out and can you imagine? Can you just I try to put myself in that position. Like I went to Africa last year and I'm like, these guys run after lions. And I mean, can you imagine doing that and going, I'm going to defeat you? What? Like that's traumatic.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and we were designed to live through that and engage in it, right?
Yeah.
We modernized ourselves to be as comfortable as possible.
That's right.
And one of my favorite books currently is called The Comfort Crisis. And it is such a true book because it talks about how one of the reasons why we have such high anxiety, and I don't know if you can relate to this or not, but I have a lot of sympathy for people that experience anxiety. It's also one of my specialties and part of my practice, and I've seen this huge
Yeah.
increase of anxiety diagnosis and people suffering through it. But I think it's really difficult when you've been a first responder at Sandy Hook, when you've witnessed what you witnessed, when you've been through the things that I've been through, to let yourself get all worked up over things that you and I, and people that have been to trauma know are going to work themselves out and are
Right.
going to be okay. But I think humans have become so comfortable and so isolated and sheltered in
Mm.
not the realities of life and saying, you know what, I'm going to embrace life because there are supposed to be sad times. There are supposed to be hard times. I am supposed to have to work really, really, really hard. And that's something that, you know, I so admire about my older son because all of his friends, all of them, right? He grew up in America, are in college. And a lot of people will say to me, like, well, he's missing out. Shouldn't he be getting an education? And I'm laughing. I'm like, do you understand the education that this kid is getting being a professional athlete? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if he gets injured or doesn't, you know, make it mega big because the core grit this kid is building of
Mm.
competing against grown men for a spot on the field that day or of the politics, you know, as he's getting more into it, he'll call me like, Mom, there's so many politics. I'm like, baby, in everything in life, there's politics, right?
Yeah.
In everything in life, there's these, you know, agents and making deals and technical directors and you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
but that's also kind of traumatic for a young man to realize. Like, I thought if you
Yeah.
just worked hard and played good, you know, everything was going to be good. And there's so many other elements. But I'm like, do you guys understand that he is in the classroom of life? And I couldn't be more proud of him. It is such a hard thing to get up every day and know that if you have a bad day, you might not play that week.
Yeah.
And your whole
Well,
job relies on it.
that's right. In real life, if you get up and have a bad day, you might lose your job, or you might lose your marriage, you might lose anything in life, right? So
Right.
it's important to embrace it. It's
Yeah,
important to
and
keep
we have to
moving
embrace
forward.
life. Yeah, absolutely. We
Yeah.
have to embrace life. And I think there's some hard skin that comes with trauma that a lot of people we need to create that more in our children, right? That ability to say, okay, can't fix that for you, you know,
Yeah.
which my dad was really good at when we were growing up. He's like, what are you going to do about it? You know, like,
Well, I had a guest on, Brittany Viola Gonzalez. She was a Olympic diver. Her dad, similar to ours, was a very famous baseball pitcher. Frank Viola actually played with my dad back in the
oh,
day with the Twins. And but Brittany, made it to the Olympic team and everything else. And she had some things go on, and yeah, I had her on the podcast. But she used to talk about it like backstage, front stage. The front stage of our lives, like you're putting on this happy face, but the backstage part, like it's the trauma, the anxiety, the whatever it is, the pain is just killing you on the inside, but you're afraid to tell anybody on the front stage what's really going on. And I think, like, your dad, your grandma seems like she had it nailed. She's gonna tell everybody what's going on the front stage, and I don't even care, but I'm gonna tell everybody what's going on in the backstage too, right? And your dad had that same mentality, but he did it with grace. And you have that. You can
And
tell.
he's still, I think he's allowed himself to be vulnerable. It's really interesting. He's still of that old school of like, keep it to yourself,
Yeah.
because I remember I did an interview once for a course that I made on emotional intelligence. And the producer was doing questions. I didn't know what questions were going to be asked. I wasn't prepared for it. And he asks me, like, at what moment in your life or moments in your life did you understand the need for support, right? The need to lean on other people. And it just came out of me. And I told the story of stepping out of the car, coming from the airport into the funeral home. And I look across the street and my entire high school class is standing there,
Oh, wow.
just just standing there for me. And it still
Wow.
brings tears to my eyes and chills. And I was like, they're there for me,
Yeah, that's
and I'm not
amazing.
alone. And that's the first time in my life that I understood the power of community and support. But I'm bawling in the interview, right? Like I'm tearing up
Yeah.
now, but I'm bawling in the interview.
Yeah.
And the producer and the makeup lady and the camera guy, they're like, we need to pause. They're like, we were not ready for this, right? And I'm like crying, we're all crying. So I called my dad, I thought it was a sweet moment. I thought it
Yeah.
was a good thing. And my dad goes, you're using your sister's death for publicity. And I was like, what? Yeah, that's how my dad saw it. Isn't that
Wow.
crazy? So he's
Yeah.
still with that old school mentality of like, I'll tell my family that I'm vulnerable, but not to where you are, which I think is so much more powerful. But that's okay, right?
Yeah.
Generationally, we're growing.
Right.
Generationally, like baby boomers, right? Your dad, my dad, it was like, keep it in, like
Yeah.
they consider it dirty laundry. Like, let's not
Yeah.
talk about mental health struggles outside the house. And he was vulnerable and very cool and collected, and he still is. But I thought it was really surprising that that was his interpretation of that moment, you
Yeah.
know? And I just said, Dad, like my goal is to let people know that they're not alone. There's other people that
Yeah.
have lost family members that I think this will help. And he heard me and he didn't argue with me, but I still know like his preference was like, let's just not talk about it. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like out there.
You're bringing up a good point, though. I mean, it's important to talk about it. It's important to recognize it when you see somebody that's struggling. Especially someone you've been around, right? Like, and they're hurting or they've just gone through a traumatic event, whatever that situation is. It's okay to just ask how they're doing. And I had a lot of friends reach out that didn't have relatable experiences and they were just there. They constantly just said, "Hey man, how you doing? Just checking in with you. Just want to make sure you're good. I feel so bad what you're going through." And then I had friends that were like combat vets, national security, like people that experienced some of the trauma and saw some of the things that I had seen that reached out to me but were more engaged with me. I felt more apt to talk to them
Yeah.
and share my kind of what was going on mentally. My other friends, though, it was super important to be there. So I could relate to like you seeing all your high school friends sitting there. But Tatiana, this is you have touched on so many different aspects of the trauma journey,
Yeah.
right? And what
It is a
I
journey.
mean, you're a warrior in it. The RX for Life, mentalhealthsolutionsonline.com, I think is amazing. I want to push your book and do what we can there. But how can people, what's probably the best way for people to get a hold of you, follow you on social? We're going to share
Yeah.
that.
So I'm working on being better on social media. That's something that, again, right, the ingraining of my dad of like growing up and like let's be private, private, private. It's just taken me a while to like actually like be on social media. I'm mostly on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Tatiana Miller. But my website is the best way. It has a way to reach out to me. Sometimes I'll get emails of people like when we share stories like this that'll say, hey, I'm going through this. what did you do about that? So always feel free to ask me. I love, when I say I love to be a resource for people. After everything that I went through, I started to walk again, and I started to really have really strong faith in prayer, because I would pray a lot when I was in rehab, and just to like soothe my soul is what I call it. I remember I went through this course where they were like, write out what you want your legacy to be, right? Like, write how you want people to remember you. And I wrote, I want to be a resource for people so that they shift from survival to thriving. And so if there's anything that I can share with you, even if it's just like a hi, like, please reach out to me on my website. That is what makes my heart, beat every day. That's my purpose. And so my website has, my book, it has a radio show that I do every week. And it's on North Texas radio. And I just talk about emotional intelligence too. Like, I'm like you, I would just want to share tools with people, because I feel like that's something that we didn't touch on, that like, we do have a lot of people experiencing crisis and trauma, but we're not equipping people. Like, to me, it's like this. We teach people math, we teach people reading, we teach people history. We need to teach them emotional intelligence. If we don't have emotional intelligence, how are we going to be functional in life? So my goal and my passion and RX for Life is about teaching emotional intelligence. I do a lot of nonprofit work. Like, I'll go for free and do talks, motivational talks, if there's an organization that could benefit from it. Like, I recently did a podcast and had a sex trafficking organization that reached out and said, hey, would you want to do a talk for our survivors? I'm like, yes, when do you want me to come? Like, it's all about, like, you just giving back and helping empower people. So please reach out to me. And I loved our time together. I feel like we could have touched on so much more. I'd love to have you on my show, and we can continue the conversation.
Let's go.
I absolutely love working with athletes because of that. Like, they don't even realize, right? They're in tuneness, because that's not what they're aiming to do. They just want to be good at their sport.
Right. That's right.
I love picking the brains of athletes too, and I'd love to connect. We're so close to one another too.
I know. Well, you're definitely somebody that's easy to talk with. You're just, you've got this aura to you that you can tell you truly want to give. And that's awesome. I mean, the character, the faith base, I lean heavily on that. Every day I pray for love in this world. I just hope that we can all just continue to hopefully get along. And, I pray for my family. I pray for my own patience and own peace, and just that I can keep moving my boots forward, to help others where I can. So
Well, you are.
keep up the fight.
Thank you. You so are, just with this. And, what I have found too with this kind of stuff is, like, you just never know when somebody needed to hear a piece
That's
of
right.
what you're saying. And I have found that, I mean, that's what, I just want to share one more quick story. When I was looking online of people that had a similar back surgery to me, all I found was, this made me fat, I hurt more, like, all negative stuff, right? There was one guy, and he was a war vet, and he wrote one blog, just one post. And his post was, I feel so much better. But the reason I feel better is because no matter what, after this surgery, first of all, I got up as soon as I could and I walked as far as I could go. And the next day, I walked one step further. And the next day, I walked one more step, and then one more step, and then one more step. It was that man, I don't even know his name, one person out of hundreds that wrote, this is terrible, this won't work. One guy that just said, hey, it's just one step at a time.
Wow.
And if you fall on your booty, you get back up. And I did. I walked with a cane, right? But that's what I want to leave everybody with, just one step at a time. And I think that's kind of what you and I are saying that has worked for us. And it's a one step at a time thing, and a believing that everything's going to work out as it needs to.
That's right. It will. Positive of the thought process of always being positive, the being in control of your mind, body, and spirit as you live.
Yeah.
So I love that. But thank you again for being on. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, keep going in.
All right. Bye-bye.